I've unlearned as much as I've learned in covering these issues over this span of time. And so I'm going to take you on a little bit of that journey, and also we will grapple with current events. My big personal climate change has been away from telling stories, which has been my stock and trade for so long, toward facilitating better conversations. And I'll explain why I think that's important. I did bring some artifacts, you'll see in a second, the old kind of storytelling. I've moved away from thinking about goals. Right now, the climate talks are on in, where are they this year? Baku in Azerbaijan, in a petrostate, which is what we're in now to a certain extent. And it's all about numbers, how many $1 trillion rich countries are going to give to poor countries, et cetera. But what we need to think about, I think, more and more is just general trajectories. Are we on the right path, or a path that's diverting away from a world with abundant, clean energy that's equitably available and that isn't overheating the climate? Are we on that trajectory or not? And letting go of the idea that we have a specific numerical goal, and if we miss it, we're screwed. The 1.5 number is not useful. It gets, we're missing 1.5. Yeah, big, yes, but we don't even know within a number of points of degrees how warm it's going to get, how our emissions are going to go. So getting away from numbers toward general trajectories is good. And getting away from climate change itself. Climate change, global warming, this is my 1988 article, is CO2 emissions accumulating in the atmosphere, changing climate. And that's, it's one driver of risk, but many of the drivers of community risk from the climate system are right here on the ground, whether you're in Rye or in the Amazon. It's what do you do on the ground in your community to help ensure people aren't overheating or a species has got a place to move to. Those are the things that are actually the key driver of opportunity or risk right now. Climate change is there, it has to be addressed, but it's not, if it's in the foreground, you're missing something. By the way, if you have a cell phone and you like QR codes and stuff, there are several QR codes in here that will lead you to pieces that are relevant to what I'm talking about. So this has happened. I just put this together. I just did this. This is a new talk because so much is new, right? And I can't think about this wrecking crew without thinking about Godzilla and this president-elect. He has branded destruction, and some things need to be broken. There are aspects of our system that are really problematic right now. For energy, if you want to build out energy, our current way of doing things is broken. But he's nominating a fracking industry executive to be the Department of Energy, head of the Secretary of Energy. Of course, the main job of the Secretary of Energy is managing nuclear stockpiles. I'm not sure what a fracking executive knows about that, but we'll get to that. So save your questions. I did write a ton about the previous Trump administration, about the Bush administration. I even, back in 2015, did something about Trump and the psyche, our psyche, not just his psyche. But I think now we're moving toward, there's actually a celebratory video about him right now on social media. He's a wrecking ball. And again, this is kind of, that's his brand. And how we grapple with that will be not just very important, it's the issue of our time, and not just for the climate. But we're going to scroll back briefly to my journey. So as I said, 1988, I was a very old-fashioned reporter. I started in magazines. The first cover story I did on global warming was in 1988, which was the year it really became a story. And that was, I was in my early 30s, and now I'm in my late 60s. So that's literally half a lifetime ago, which is kind of interesting to think about. And the story was already at that point was more complicated than you'd think. The back cover of the magazine, so here's the front cover. Global warming, worry about it. The back cover was, hey, cigarettes, buy some. So anyone who thinks the communication environment is complicated now, just look back. It was always complicated. And we weren't staging newsroom walkouts and saying, like, we need to stop that advertising. I don't think we weren't thinking about that. We were just young journalists doing science writing. And I'm really happy about that story because while it was mostly about the basics of the greenhouse effect, carbon dioxide traps heat, blah, 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 sea level rise, it had hurricane patterns changing, it had everything we've been thinking about ever since. But it also had a section on development. I was just talking with someone who has worked for a long time in sustainable development. And, you know, even then, in 1988, I wrote, how can the developed countries, meaning us and Europe and to some extent Japan, how can we tell China that they don't have the right to burn their coal? What's the ethical argument there? China had half of its population with no access to the grid. They spent, this is 1990, here's 1988, right? So this is China's GDP. And that was largely done getting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, burning coal and building cities and making cement, energy-intensive processes. And they were basically catching up with us in their development track. And now they have more emissions of greenhouse gases than we do. But do we say shame on them for that or not? It's complicated. And this is new coal-powered plant proposals in China. They're still growing. Our emissions are going down. Our coal use is going down here. So even in 1988, you know, I was starting to understand this is not a simple story. And then I came to this ecosystem. I had worked briefly at the LA Times in the 80s, but when I got to the New York Times in 1995 to cover regional environmental issues, it was my first real super saturated immersion in a newsroom where one of my editors, I was running late on a story on the New York City Park Conservancy meeting, you know, a little 400-word story, and he says, you know, Revkin, this ain't no seed catalog. He had learned that from another editor who grew up in Kansas. And he was right, you know, so and the story, it was a competitive ecosystem. The front page meetings were every afternoon, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, when there was still a front page and not a home page. The editors, the main editors would get together and they would be competing for the front page. The science editor would come in with one of my stories, but there would be the business editor and local news and sports, and they're all saying, well, no, our story's more important. And climate change was always kind of, it didn't have the dimensions you have for front page news most of the time. And sometimes you'd end up in this like overemphasis on the news end of a climate story. And I started writing about the media aspects here. This is 2008, I wrote a story on what I was calling media whiplash, because you know, we would say, you'd see one day, you know, like with methane emissions right now, it's a crisis, and now we know we just learned a week ago that most of the methane that's growth recent years has been from tropical wetlands, not from fracking. Oh, so your head can kind of, so wait, and you told us coffee was bad for us, and now you tell us coffee is good, and Atkins, and so this whiplash phenomenon is a problem if you overemphasize the stories to make it through to the front page. And it's the same thing in TV and everywhere else. So I got to sort of understand all of this, and it was very frustrating, and I felt like I didn't want to play that game all the time. Then I started to divert. In 2003, 21 years ago, I went to the North Pole for the New York Times, and I was kind of a backpack journalist. I had my video cameras, and I was trying to collect sound and do whatever I could to bring the story back. I had a satellite phone, and I was very proud of all that. But the thing that was most interesting at the North Pole, in retrospect, wasn't that. It was that in 2003, a young editor on the nascent homepage of the New York Times, she said, I'm on the satellite phone there, you know, on the sea ice, 15 below zero, in a tent though. We're talking and she says, hey, why don't we do a reader Q&A? And this is, you know, like a decade or two before AMAs and all that stuff, Reddit. And I said, okay. So she put a note on the front page of on the homepage. Andy Revkin's on the sea ice at the North Pole. Do you have questions? And then she recited them into the phone, and I answered them, and she typed them out. So it was very crude kind of a thing. But after that, I was saying, oh, that's interesting. I can have a conversation with my readers. You know, and it was very different than this. You know, when I'd write a story, and maybe a month later there'd be some letters to the editor. And I really think that issues like climate change, you'll talk about this more, the complexity of them cries out for conversation more than professorial kind of, here's the story, Walter Cronkite style, that's the way it is, doesn't fit well for this kind of issue. And that's why in 2007, as you heard, I started a blog at the New York Times called .earth. And no one was saying, hey, Andy, we need a sustainability blog. I just felt it was a better fit for these kinds of multidimensional questions. Like, how do we not overheat the climate and give abundant energy to people who have none right now? How do you do that? It's more of it's a journey more than a story. And it was really interesting. It was very hard in its own way. And I kept trying to innovate there too. I was tired of what we see too much on social media now, which is people yelling at each other with their fingers or thumbs. And one day at the New York Times, I realized, our comment part of our website, you can actually embed a YouTube video in there. I thought, that's interesting. So I put on the blog, hey, if you're reading the blog, you like what I'm doing or not, just post a little video on YouTube saying, here I am. And the first person to do it was in Japan.
Hello everyone, I'm Wang Su-yang. I'm here in Japan to say greeting to you. Hope you read more and more comments on .earth. Of course, I will read more and more comments on .earth too.
And I was trying to break away from the brittleness of other kinds of communication by showing people their own faces. And it never went far because it was just me doing it. The Times had no clue what I was doing. It was this little, side note to all this bigger stuff going on. But I felt good. And that blog ran for 9 years and had 100,000 comments. And I moderated almost all of them because we didn't have any of the staff for that stuff back then. And I was thinking, wow, this is cool. This is like, there were these two 20th century scientist philosophers who had thought of that we're getting to this point of the world having a noosphere, they called it, a planet of the mind. Like, we're all going to get connected and everything will be magical. And I was really I was kind of like, that was my moment before the crash into what we see now. Then it got complicated because very quickly, the internet became this place where you could find whatever story you wanted to find, any vantage point on the climate issue or on immigration or on whatever. You could find someone to feed you that particular view of the story. And that's when it started to feel a little more depressing. There's this continual tension I have between the Walter Cronkite I grew up with. We all like that. It was like comfort food. Everyone who's old enough to remember the nightly news, we all saw the same thing. You might have disagreed with it, but we all had a baseline. And now this is like comfort food, but it's like the world's biggest buffet. Everyone can, oh, you like sushi, you like barbecue, and go out there and then yell at each other. And the yelling for me got most intense in the end of 2009 when this guy said this.
This guy from the New York Times, if he really thinks that humanity is destroying the planet, that human beings in their natural existence are going to cause the extinction of life on Earth, Andrew Revkin. Mr. Revkin, why don't you just go kill yourself and help the planet by dying?
It was amazing. He kind of spent the subsequent week almost apologizing on subsequent shows because I think advertisers don't like people, talking about suicide. But he never did. But I'm still here. And he's not. So before I go on, here's just a little brief, let's everyone take a breath because this is a hard time. The day before Election Day, this was in Maine in our living room. So everyone just take a breath. We adopted these dogs this year. There was just a collie walking around here. So when I tweeted that or whatever, I was saying, this is a good time to be like a dog, where you're just alive and not dealing with these past, present, future uncertainty, tensions. But of course, we are. So the human species has other dimensions of our awareness of the world that make it real. Yeah, we can live like a dog. We can all just sort of, live our life and tune out all the stuff that's going on, but that has consequences too. So there's the newsroom climate, there's the physical climate, and the social climate is the place where the biggest problems are and also where the solutions lie for me. And my reporting for that from like 1988 through 2006, literally, I remember the story that changed things for me, was all about the biogeophysical climate and technical things like emissions, treaties, and blah, blah, blah. And that the first time I interviewed a social scientist, I'm pretty sure it was in 2006, on a story I did for the Times on why is everybody yelling at each other. This was after Al Gore's movie came out, and Senator Inhofe, who later threw snowballs on the floor of the Senate, that stuff was just getting into overdrive. And by 2009, 2010, I'd learned about Dan Kahane's science. He's a psychologist at the Yale Law School, and he was doing empirical work, experimental work, where he found that what people believe about global warming doesn't reflect what they know. It expresses who they are. It's a cultural identity thing. And as you know, there's so much identity politics now. This is old news. This is your gun rights status, sense, what do you want to do with healthcare, immigration. Lots of those things are not, they're more about your culture and your background than they are about literacy on the data. But this study really knocked my socks off, because he found that in one study, he found that people who are most literate about what's a greenhouse gas or those issues are at both ends of the spectrum of belief on climate. The people who are most dismissive and most alarmed had the highest basic literacy in climate science. And here I am as a journalist. There's actually a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism. And what I was absorbing through this work was that simply explaining stuff doesn't necessarily change people's where they are on that spectrum, because high literacy can, if you're really smart, you know how to build an argument, right? Steve Koonin, who's a total climate rejecter, NYU professor, I've interviewed him many times. He's been on my webcast, and he's one of the smartest people on the planet. But these are 4 different Nobel Prize winners at that time when I wrote about this then, who had completely divergent views of this problem. So literally, you could go into a bar, have an argument with someone, and pick a Nobel Prize winner to be standing at your shoulder, like Woody Allen in that movie where he called in Marshall McLuhan, and you know nothing of my work. But you could, so that's kind of depressing as a journalist for sure. It meant that just the facts, Jack, doesn't actually do anything, or not much. Now, but this same work shows unbelievable opportunity. It just means that the crisis in your own head may not be the thing you start to talk about first when you're thinking about global warming. John Sutter, who is a good friend of mine, a filmmaker, he used to be at CNN. In 2015, he went around the world doing a series of reports on people and attitudes about global warming before the Paris Agreement talks, which were that December of that year. And he went to Woodward County, Oklahoma, in the oil patch, which some studies had shown was the most skeptical county in America on global warming. And he's from Oklahoma originally, so he was really interested to go there anyway. And so he went there and he just did these interviews. This is like less than a minute, but it's so illuminating.
I'm not a real firm believer in climate change. Well, I'm employed in the oil field.
I have an oil and gas company.
If there's no oil field, there's no jobs.
Our whole economy runs on fossil fuels.
Now you might say the environment is perfect today because God ultimately controls the environment. We're going to try to have a solar system big enough to supply all the needs of our house.
So, what did that guy just say? God controls the environment. Pause. he works for an oil company, and we're going to get off the grid with solar panels. And John went to his house. There's a long piece that John, if you search for John Sutter, Woodward, Oklahoma, you'll find this long article he wrote. That guy is a creationist. He funded the local dinosaur park. There's like a kiddie park that's dinosaurs and people playing with each other. And but he's getting off the grid, and he's getting off the grid had nothing to do with global warming, had to do with being a good old-fashioned independent, limited government American. I guarantee you, he did not vote for Hillary. Well, this was 2015. He definitely didn't vote for Hillary, and he didn't vote for Harris. I'm sure. So if you go into his town with a big sign saying climate crisis, what does that do? He's getting off the grid. He's passionate about solar power, but he's doing it because he would rather generate his own electricity than have to pay some goddamn utility for the electrons. But that libertarian aspect also means he's never going to vote for a Democrat. So, sorry, what was that?
So what?
So that.
It's a good thing. I don't see what's the problem.
Well, no, that's the issue.
I mean, have the Democrats had a better?
Well, here's the problem. Historically, the Democrats have gone at this as a partisan, factional, us and them issue that doesn't look for the opportunity of building a wider coalition with people like this guy, because he's seen as a write-off anyway. So, and realistically, he was never going to vote for a Democratic president. So in that sense, he's probably is a write-off. But if your goal is more solar power, which theoretically that would be what the goal should be, then that gives you an opportunity that in many cases was missed, I think. So that's why I think it's important to think about. And even within people who are eager for climate solutions, these are two friends of mine, Jim Hansen, the scientist who first put global warming on the landscape, and he was in that article, 1988, and Bill McKibben, who's famous New Yorker writer, 350.org founder, Third Act founder, and they have completely divergent views on what to do about global warming, even though they've actually chained themselves to the same White House fence. So on activism, they have the same view. But Jim Hansen completely rejects that renewable energy can get you to a decarbonized global economy. He's very much supportive of nuclear power. Bill McKibben has only slowly started to say, well, maybe some nuclear power. But back then, he was totally rejecting nuclear. It's all about distributed solar and the people's power. So that they kind of reflect the possibility of having divergent views and doing some things together, chaining their selves to fences. I haven't done that part. But I have, our Venn diagrams overlap for sure. And I wrote about, I lived near Indian Point for a long time. I was in the plant twice as a reporter. And I'm supportive of, absolutely, I was supporting extending the life of that nuclear power plant. My wife, my wonderful wife, who may be here in a little while, she's absolutely supportive of turning it off as soon as possible, which is what Cuomo did. And now some nuclear power plants are being reactivated, not in this state, but, what Cuomo did at a certain point, though, he knew that the politics around the upstate nuclear power plants would justify keeping them going. The politics around this one wouldn't. So he had what I called a some nukes policy. And you're probably getting a pattern here with me, right? I'm kind of a some person, not a yes or no person. But how do you build a movement for some nukes? Like, how do you put that on a sign? There's no nukes and there's nukes, but there isn't some nukes. And somehow, one of the opportunities and challenges we face is to have at least that sort of possibility of having those conversations that aren't just from the edges. 10 years ago, right near here, Jacob Burns Film Center, I don't know if anyone was there, I moderated a debate between Bobby Kennedy Jr. and the filmmaker Robert Stone, who had come out with a film supporting nuclear energy. And Bobby was rabidly against it, and it was not a civil debate, which kind of presaged some aspects of RFK Jr. that we're seeing in spades now. And we'll have plenty of time for questions. So this is this concept that I've come across that I originally learned about in ecosystem science, where they found that ecosystems that are resilient to environmental stress, the most resilient ones tend to have, it's not the diversity of species in the ecosystem so much as the diversity of responses to stress. So if everyone in the room here, you know, if it's getting too hot and you all said, we need better air conditioning, or as opposed to some said, we should open the windows, or if you have a diversity of responses to a complex challenge, that tends to be more adaptive, more of a source of resilience than if we were all, like if we were, Greta Thunberg has done great things by, the Swedish activist, by stimulating a lot of discussion and challenging the status quo. Bill Gates is like the antithesis of her in terms of his approach to global warming. If we were all Greta, or if we were all Bill Gates, my strong sense is we would be screwed. We can't all be those things. And but how do you tolerate or even embrace a need to have that level of diversity as we approach a big question like maintaining a livable climate and adequate energy? And even Bill, I interviewed him for the New York Times. There's a long video interview we did in 2016. And I brought up this guy, Harish Hande, who's an energy innovator at the level of little villages in India. Like he'll go to a village and say, he doesn't start with how do we get your electricity? He starts with what do you need? What's your energy needs? And then he'll use a solar powered grain mill or the like to help those communities just get a little less poor and have a little more time to their lives to do the quality things we do in our lives. But Bill kind of just sort of didn't, he's all about mass energy, you know, big nuclear power plants, new ones. And I think we need to figure out how to do all of that. And so in the end, after this whole journey, you know, I started out thinking climate change is a pollution problem. Like we did all that work on soot and particulate emissions, and LA cleaned up its air for the most part. And we, you know, catalytic converters and NOx filters and stuff. And then I said, oh, no, it's like a technical problem, or it's a power problem, meaning the power of fossil fuel companies. It's a justice problem, absolutely. It's a behavior problem, like I showed earlier, cultural cognition. Perception, it's a condition to manage, not a problem. It's not even a problem. It's a condition, a phenomenon. We are a species that craves energy, like every living thing on the planet. And we're not yet in a 21st century brain. We have a brain you can't just replace our reptilian part of our brain. And how do we do that? And of course, it's every story. It's like one of these hydras. And that leads me to, this feels depressing, but to me it's also encouraging because it means everyone could do something. If you're an artist or engineer, entrepreneur, activist, everyone has some role to play at the local scale and at the global scale. At the same time, it's a different framing for the whole issue to think it's not a problem, it's not a crisis. We're developing a new relationship with energy and a new relationship with climate. And for me, the way I manage this is I break it into pieces. Like, okay, this gets me, as you heard earlier, I don't like people, that's not the right way to frame it. Shouting climate emergency is so vague and amorphous unless you start to say, who's in a state of emergency? How do we respond to that? What are the ways to do that? And as you start to break things into pieces, everything becomes actionable. And it's still big, but it's actionable. You know, I don't know anyone, I've never met anyone who would rather live in a house that would flood when there's a heavy rain than a house that was built not to flood. I wrote about this, this was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, probably 8 years ago. There was like a 20-inch downpour, like we've just seen many of these. And all these houses were wrecked. Many of those communities after this started relaxing their zoning, not tightening it. And one mayor was quoted as saying, we'll be a ghost town otherwise. You know, oh my God. But still, this house was built in the 1880s in the same general vicinity. This is not that much harder to do than that. And it would save you money in the long run. So what can we do with zoning, with building codes, whether it's wildfire, coastal resilience, inland flooding. There's lots of discussions you can have with people across the political spectrum because no one really wants to go through that if they can avoid it. And the same thing with energy. Yeah, and this is just one slide I have to show. To get comfortable with the fact that this is not a quick journey, I talked to a lot of energy wonks, and this guy, Holger Rogner, near Vienna, has been at this for decades and decades. You don't have to, basically this is how much carbon per unit of energy, like to running these light bulbs, how much of it's carbon emissions over time since 1800. So this is our decarbonization journey. Since 1800, and here's 1960, 1970, 2000. This is global, the whole world. Like if you add up all the world's energy use, the amount of carbon per unit of energy is going down and down and down. And there's no, you don't see like Paris Agreement. It just has the big scale, the grand scale. This is a long journey we're on. And innovation can make big differences, but it's a long journey. And that feels hard, but it's, to me, important. Trump, here we go, a little bit on Trump. Carbon brief recently, and this is before, as you can see, this was when it was still Biden and not Harris. But this was a model based on policies, a model kind of trajectory for from 2030 through 2050. Theoretically, under the Paris Agreement, this is going to zero by 2050. The difference between Trump and Biden, this is US emissions only. So it's like 6 billion tons per year. And they calculated that the difference here is about 4 billion tons collectively through that span of time. Or just by 2030. So just from here to here, from here to here. This is the Trump, this is the next 4 years, roughly. And 4 billion tons sounds, hey, that's pretty cool. But global emissions right now are 40 billion tons, global. The United States is about 13% of global emissions. So, you know, you'll hear from in the Wall Street Journal editorial board, and they are right, that whatever we do is a tiny fraction of what would need to be done in the world. So it's really, they would say it's meaningless what the United States does. Of course, that's not true, because leadership can lead to new innovations and technologies and et cetera. But the grand scale problem is so much bigger than our problem. And CO2 is a globally mixed gas. Once you emit it, those molecules go everywhere. And this is through 2100, which is the real scale of the challenge. You can cut off, the good news is you can cut this bar off, because recent analyses of what's called business as usual no longer include that. It's more, this is current policies is pretty much business as usual now. So that's the great news. We're not going to 4 degrees centigrade by 2100. It's not happening. And the United States is right we're talking right, 2020, 2030, right here. This is like where we are right now. And what you want to do is build the capacity to go lower. Setting aside all the numbers, what can we do to make the world's trajectories lower? Innovation, bringing advanced energy to places that have none. Those are really important problems, and they're not going to be resolved very well given what at least the Trump administration has kind of projected so far. A little bit of good news before we get to Q&A. And many of you probably already know this. In the United States, our trajectories on energy are already detached from presidential policy. Presidents, as I said earlier, really, they can make little differences, but mostly we're on a track. I wrote this in 2015, no red and blue divide when it comes to renewable energy innovation and CO2. That was studies of people's attitudes, like that guy in Oklahoma. So setting aside what you hear on CNN or MSNBC or Fox, everyone thinks this is reasonable. And state wind and solar leaders, this is new. Texas, red state.
Today announced that they wanted to join back the grid, the national grid, I think they said today.
To join into the grid?
The grid to be reattached.
Well, they should. Yeah, just like with what I said earlier about resilience, having a true national grid would be a good thing, because if Texas has more than enough renewable energy, then they can sell it out to the rest of us. Iowa has pretty much ended using coal in the last 10, 15 years, and they've moved to wind. And Iowa's well, as we heard in the election, maybe they're getting a little more blue. But the key point, the main point is that there's a nonpartisan enthusiasm for integrating renewable energy into our electricity grids. In Maine, where I live now, even before the Biden's bills came in, the Maine government has been stimulating the use of heat pumps. This is one of our heat pumps that we installed a couple of years ago. So those are independent of federal policy. They're helped for sure by federal policy like the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill. But and here's another reality. We think a lot about the emissions side, CO2 going to the atmosphere, but we don't think about the opportunities in cutting vulnerability. You know, whether your community floods, you know, how many of you have been stuck on the Sawmill Parkway? Any parkway that's named after a river is going to flood. And we're surrounded by that. And those are mostly, at least state, local decisions can make a huge difference. And even at the global scale, you know, I think a lot about Bangladesh, early part of the 20th century, when a cyclone hit Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands of people died. There was the concert from Bangladesh George Harrison did back in 1970-ish. That was because of an epic disaster. 500,000 people died. And now those death rates are down almost to nil because Bangladesh there's radio, there's warning systems, there's radar, and there's a way to get that information to communities. And communities have these simple structures like a place to go when it's flooding. And it goes beyond that. One of the most exciting stories I've heard about adaptation at the community scale is about there was a program to do small loans to farmers in Bangladesh to switch from chickens to ducks. And it's more profitable. They get a higher profit margin. And of course, what happens to a duck in a flood? They float. What happens to a chicken? They drown. So that's just a tiny example of how we can, if they can do it in Bangladesh, we can do it too. And there's a community of geographers who talk about this using what they call the expanding bullseye. They create you can have a community map of your vulnerability to flooding, fire, et cetera. And what they're showing, this is more of a generalized one. So here's a river, like the Sawmill. Here's a community in 1950. Here's that same community in 2010. Lots more people, lots more stuff. Climate is changing a little. So you'll see the flood patterns will change. That will widen a little bit. But what's the biggest source of danger? More people and more stuff. And that's happening way faster than climate is changing. So search for this word, expanding bullseye. I've written about this a lot since 2017. And what we can do is reverse that through smarter planning, zoning, and the like. It's so obvious. And so a climate-centric view misses that. If we're just thinking about global warming, you're not thinking about local growth, then you're missing some important things. I don't want to go on too long. Asheville is a prime example of this. They had an epic, horrible flood in 1916. They had an epic, horrible flood in 1791. Same rivers, same places, and they had one just now. And a lot of people on social media were going, oh my God, this is unthinkable, this is unprecedented, this is something new. No, what's new is that there are a lot more people living in that part of Western North Carolina. And that's not about global warming. So we'll, give me 1 second. Well, yeah, one quick question.
Yeah, I saw some analysis that said the Tennessee Valley Authority had, whenever it was, 100 years ago, built lots of dams to control flooding in that part of the world, but that Asheville didn't want. That's right.
I actually touched on that in a piece recently. Yes, and so this gets at the reality. Local, like what I said earlier about Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the local politics is build, 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 not retreat, 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 and or support a dam, because if you're damming a reservoir, you're displacing people from a river valley that they historically loved. So those are issues that are going to be there in spades going forward. where are we on time? I don't want to run too long because I really want to get to questions. I'm going to just show you this one last thing. This woman, Diana Liverman, she's a geographer at the University of Arizona who recently retired. And she said something to me in one of my webcasts that just has stayed with me. And hopefully it can help rearrange your modes of thinking a little bit. It's so simple. And this gets at the reality that if we switch from thinking when there's a storm or a flood or a news story, if you put climate risk as the foreground question and not, oh, is this climate change, then things change in magical ways.
When we talk about climate risk, some people still just think, oh, it's the probability of a heat wave, but we need to think about risk not as the probability of the heat wave, but as the probability of harm.
That is so, to me, it's so...
In addition to sort of population.
She talks about poverty. Poverty is the main driver of vulnerability, and or prejudice. If you were marginalized through prejudice or poverty, and you're living in a floodplain, or you don't have access to water, then that's the issue there. So that statement, I'm just going to freeze it there. Is just risk is hazard times exposure factoring vulnerability. The hazard is the fire, the flood, the coastal storm. But the exposure is how many people, how many homes, and the vulnerability is it a mobile home in a tornado zone? I've written many stories about what happens there, and it's not a pretty picture. And so poverty alleviation is a climate strategy when you think about it. And here, you can take a picture again if you want to. Or, I'll make sure this is available in some way or other for anyone who wants to. I did a whole climate risk reporting tutorial for journalists on this, and it's hopefully changing the way some people report. And then the justice angle is always there. Sorry? Yeah, oh yeah. That was in my 1988 article. The justice angle is there hugely. We don't even know what Trump is going to be doing with FEMA and the like. But billionaires in the Hamptons were getting funding to replenish beaches under federal programs. But who's not getting the funding is the communities that don't have consultants and lawyers who even know how to ask for the money, let alone have a purpose for it. So that issue is going to be there going forward. This is another, I think if there's one thing we could do, the disaster folks I talk to speak a lot about what's called an all hazards approach to risk reduction. Every community, well, right now we're in this drought here with fire being a significant threat around this region, not usually, but right now. So when you look around the landscape, whether it's heat or cold or flooding or fire, what can we all do and what can agencies do to better inform us of the aggregate risk from those different things? And what you often find is that there's solutions to one problem that are also solutions to another. I did a piece on a Michigan study that showed, we're all thinking about heat, and in the summers, the Biden administration really pushed the heat thing. They had the new website, heat.gov. And I wrote critically, I said, yeah, but where's cold.gov? If you're going to, and there was a paper out of Michigan that showed that the things you would want to do in a community to reduce risk from heat exposure and vulnerability are basically the same things you would do for cold. And cold still kills more people than heat around the world and in the United States. And so a poor family with a poorly insulated home, any budget they have for electricity or whatever is going out the windows, and they're vulnerable to both. And so that gives you a way to act. And that's my mantra of, getting away from generalities and getting into specific opportunities. And finally, just stepping back to the grand scale, I love the Mannahatta Project that Wildlife Conservation Society, Eric Sanderson wrote that beautiful book, and they did this museum exhibit a long time ago showing, this was Manhattan the day before Henry Hudson went, oh, this is an interesting place. And this is Manhattan now, but we're not asking enough going forward in time. What's the Manhattan or the Rye or the Lemoyne, Maine, where I live? What do we envision in our community with that future in mind? And that's a really it's an important and underappreciated part of the task ahead. Because remember, climate change is a long time scale thing. Everyone, the media and activists try to make it a here and now thing, and it's kind of both. But I think this is the way to go forward. And I'm just going to fast forward. There, by the way, just in terms of like the information pollution out there, the one thing that's needed more than anything is audience literacy. It's no longer a given that anything you look at, whether it's from a Greenpeace or some obstructionist, it needs to be tested. And the systems we are looking at, whether it's blue sky less than Twitter, Facebook for sure, the algorithms are designed to activate you both in positive and negative ways and to lead you down rabbit holes that are not productive. At the University of Rhode Island, there's a woman named Renee Hobbs who has this Mind Over Media book and online curriculum that's all about propaganda. It's propaganda literacy. So knowing when you're being sold something is a really good thing. And calling bullshit is the University of Washington open curriculum on data literacy. And I just love that stuff. I've done what I can on my Sustain What thing, but these are really valuable tools that can be integrated into curricula, at pretty much any level. They're really wonderful. Except maybe the bullshit shouldn't be in elementary school. So finally, the reason I get away from terms like climate emergency or sustainability are break it into pieces, get beneath the surface of these emblematic statements that really don't have a lot of meaning. Sustain what, for whom, how, and then you're talking. Get nuclear power. Well, do you mean ending current nuclear power, or do you mean future designs? Making sure we're not getting into simplistic bipolar arguments, binary arguments. And I'm going to skip him. And the question mark, the journalists, good journalists that's our tool. We ask questions, and if you ask them correctly, you can get deep into things. If you're just listening for what you want to hear, that's a form of journalism that's out there too much, and that's problematic. So that's my story, and let's talk some more.